Hello and welcome to some climbing news. Been a slow news week since Tuesday, so for today, I thought I'd sit you bastards down and explain in excruciating detail how climbing grades work. A few of you were asking me to do this, so you're welcome, but also, careful what you wish for. That's right, this is the grades episode. I'm going to be going over a little bit of history, a little bit of the more philosophical and metaphysical implications of adhering to something that doesn't actually exist, which is just my douchey way of saying grades are weird, man. I'm going to talk about them. Now this whole thing is going to focus on bouldering grades because bouldering is just better. I don't care what you say, no one actually enjoys belaying, and it's the only discipline other than like free soloing and deep water or otherwise that doesn't really need it. So please, like and subscribe if you're enjoying the stuff I'm making on this channel. Tell me how wrong I am in the comments about roped climbing being worse than bouldering. Fight each other, fight me, I don't care. Let's get this goddamn show on the road. Alright, so there are a lot of bouldering grading systems out there, and I mean, now that gyms have basically gone out and started circuits, there's even more of them. You got colors in some gyms, shapes in others, friggin' this spot has dots, like half dots and 2 dots, and I guess there's spots. Actually, now that I think about it, they're definitely spots. The bouldering Bobats have a gym with peppers indicating spice levels, which is kind of dumb, but you know, so is most climbing anyways. And if you didn't know, it's actually a reference to back in the day when their vlogs started and they do challenges that ended with one of them having to eat a spoonful of whatever super spicy sauce they had. It's kind of like Hot Ones, but not really. And I'm getting sidetracked. It's still kind of a piece of interesting climbing YouTube history if you're interested. Here's a super old collab where the Eric Carlson bouldering crew and the Bobats did those challenges. It's a fun video. Check it out if you have time, because why not? But for the interest of keeping this already probably super long video a little shorter, let's focus on the 2 most important grading scales. And yeah, you guessed it, it's the Hueco and Fontainebleau scales. But first, in order to really understand grades in general, it's kind of important to understand where they came from. So we gotta do a history lesson. Yay us. Look, here's something you need to know about bouldering. Before basically like the 60s, and honestly probably even later than that, no one fucking cared about bouldering at all. Legitimately, you could probably count the number of people on one hand that actively thought bouldering was anything other than like a kinda sorta cute way to train for the real stuff. With the real stuff being big walls like El Cap and, you know, mountains. There was John Gill in the US and Pierre Alain in Fontainebleau, and that's it. Okay, like that's not really it, but those were like the main guys, the precursors, the fathers of modern bouldering, if you will. I mean, Pierre Alain basically invented climbing shoes. Remember those guys, I'm going to come back to them. Anyway, what this means is that the origins of the font scale are kind of iffy, because since no one really cared about bouldering as a discipline, no one established a proper scale for grading the difficulty of boulder problems until way later than you'd otherwise expect, which means, well, we actually got to talk about alpinism. Okay, so go back to friggin' 1894, Austrian dude named Fritz Benesch goes and proposes the first known climbing grading system, which he named after himself, because of course he did. Or, you know, I don't know if he did, but it is named after him. The Benesch system, basically. So, Roman numerals from 7 to 1, with 7 being the easiest, 1 being the hardest. The system gains popularity amongst alpinists who eventually do harder and harder climbs and find they need to broaden the scale. So a 0 and a double 0 gets added to the end of it. Cool. Then we fast forward to 1923 when German mountaineer Wilo Welsenbach took the Benesch scale, reversed the order so the higher the number, the harder the climb, which makes a lot more sense in my book, compressed the shit out of it, meaning there was no 7th grade anymore, and now the hardest thing that had been done was a 5. That scale, which Welsenbach created, became what is now known as the UIAA scale, which is still used pretty commonly in Germany, Austria, Swiss, and other parts of Eastern Europe today. Check out Andre's most recent post on Instagram. He just did a 9A route or an 11 UIAA. See, it's still being used. Now we head back to the forest of Fontainebleau, just 40 minutes outside of Paris, in France, like in Europe. You know, geography. Anyway, people had been bouldering there since the late 1800s. They started using the UIAA scale because all the people doing those boulders were mountaineers and alpinists. They needed to rate the difficulty of problems. It was the only thing they knew. First send of a boulder problem ever recorded was in 1908 when Jacques Verland climbed the font scale 3 boulder called Fissure Verland. Then you got the world's first 3+, which was climbed in 1913 and was sent by Jacques de Lépigny, a problem called L'Arrêt de l'Argent, which, by the way, is pretty tall highball. I mean, it's easier than modern day V0, but still, doing that shit in hiking boots is ballsy, to say the least. Especially when you consider that at the time, that was considered like hard. But anyways, back to Pierre Alain. See, I told you I'd come back to the guy. Dude puts rubber at the bottom of his shoes, does the world's first 5+, 1935, a climb called l'Angle Alain. And then some 10 years later, René Ferlet goes and sends La Marie Rose, the world's first 6A, which, if you haven't tried, is actually a pretty fucking hard slab problem. The feet are polished to all hell, that's why Adamanda didn't flash it, loser. I mean, I can't say much. I didn't flash it either, it took me a while, but I'm not Adamandra. I can't even, do the moves on the stuff that he can flash, so Adam, it sucks to suck. But see, that's where shit gets weird. Because I say La Marie Rose was the first 6A boulder, but at the time, the font scale didn't even exist yet. They were still doing the whole Roman numerals thing. Actually, probably didn't start switching to Arabic numerals until much later. I can't find exactly when, but I do know, for example, that La Joker, which is agreed to be the first 7A ever climbed in font, was not originally graded 7A, it was just a 6. And that was sent in 1953. It's not until 7 years later that we get the first problem to be given the 7A grade, L'Abattoir, which was effaced by Michel Libert in 1960. So it's all kind of weird, because the thing is, climbing has historically just been a bunch of random dudes and the occasional super strong chick hanging out in the woods. Not a lot of historians out there recording everything for posterity's sake. So the precise dates of a lot of things are kind of muddled and iffy, and come from super unreliable shit like word of mouth. Hell, I don't even know how or why the French sport grade and the font grading system diverged. In theory, they're the same, and were being used by the same people to grade both boulders and sport routes, but difficulty-wise, they aren't, especially at the higher end of the scale where you have shit like 9A routes and 9A boulders being wildly different in difficulty. Actually, it's pretty much widely agreed that to differentiate one with the other, the font scale has capital letters, but that's not a universal thing. Actually, check out most of font's bouldering guidebooks and you'll notice they don't actually do that. Blue.info doesn't capitalize its letters. The 5+6 and 7+8 guides don't do that either, and I can't find when the capital letter was introduced because it happened mostly in areas outside of font. Shit, I can't even tell you where. So what the fuck? But so there you go, that's the origin of the Fontainebleau bouldering scale, or at least I'm pretty sure it is. I mean, like I said, the shit's iffy, so I'm pretty damn sure what I just said is right. At the same time, likelihood some crusty dirtbag's gonna pop up in the comments with an "actually, mes amis and I made it up in 1956" or something along those lines is a little bit higher than I'm comfortable with. I guess that's just how font works, right? You try a slab for 3 hours and then grandpa appears from behind the bushes, smacks the rock with a towel a few times, throws it on the ground, cleans his shoes, and walks up your project, leaving you feeling like the past 10 years you dedicated to this stupid piece of shit sport was for nothing. I had a bad time in font, you guys. Anyways, it's time to head over to the USA. So unlike the font grading scale, the Hueco scale, we actually know a little bit more about because it was created by a dude called John Sherman. I'll get to him in a minute, because before his scale took America by storm, the place was a lawless wasteland of ungraded boulders. A wild, wild west, if you will. But in that wasteland, a single person shone bright, the father of American bouldering, John goddamn Gill. Now look, just like how the people in font took the UIAA scale and used it to grade boulders, Americans did the same with their own shit when the Sierra Club introduced the Versenbach scale in 1937. But the 1950s, that scale had evolved. The Roman numerals were gone, you had a scale that went from 1 to 5, to which, and maybe you can see where this is headed, a decimal point was added, creating the Yosemite decimal system, which is the thing used to grade basically everything but boulders in the US today. It wasn't until the 60s that the new grade of 510 was added, and from there, the subsequent divisions that would add letters to the number, aka 510A, 510B, 510C, and so on. Fun fact, if you've ever gotten absolutely sandbagged to complete shit on a 5.9 climb in America, the reason is before the 1960s, 5.9 was the hardest possible grade, meaning if you find a 5.9 route with a first ascent from 1958, chances are it's anywhere from 5.9 to 5.11 plus. And no one's gonna bother to change the grade consensus. I'll be getting to that a little bit later. But yeah, it's a fun time. So for a while, people just either didn't grade boulder problems, used the Yosemite decimal system to say boulders were 5.9 plus, or they used the B scale proposed by John Gill, which means, yes, Midnight Lightning, which is now considered V8 and probably the most famous V8 in the world, if not the most famous boulder problem ever, wasn't graded V8 when it was first climbed in 1978 by Ron Koch because the V scale didn't even exist yet. At that point, I don't know, it was probably B3? And like I said, I'll get to the Hueco scale in a second, but first, it's actually important to talk about John Gill's B scale. So I keep mentioning this John Gill guy, but who the hell is he, right? Well, honestly, he was probably the greatest boulderer of his time, doing some seriously difficult problems that today have received grades as hard as V10 in like super duper shitty non-modern climbing shoes. I mean, the guy is a rock star, but probably most interesting about him is that he was a gymnast, and as such, his approach to bouldering was more in line with gymnastics than anything else. To John Gill, style was everything. So basically, he did everything he could to make boulder problems look like, I don't know, interpretive dance, maybe? Dude hated heel hooks and never did them because he thought they looked ugly. It was all about rigidity, like how a gymnast got a hold on an iron cross with absolute perfection. As that sort of mentality is basically what inspired his grade system, which was a 3-tier scale, B1 to B3, that was fluent in nature. What does that mean? Well, pretty simply, we have to define the Bs. According to Gill, a B1 was the highest difficulty in traditional rope climbing. Since we're talking 50s and 60s, that means 5'9". B2 was literally anything harder than that. And then B3 referred to the hardest thing in the world with only a single ascent, until it was then reclassified as B2 or B1 once it was repeated. Put that into context within today's scale, and the hardest roped boulder at the moment we can say is on Adam Ondra's Silence, that one V15 sequence where his legs are doing weird shit. So V15 is B1. Anything harder than that, so all the V16s and 17s with repeats, are B2. And the only stuff out there with B3 is the stuff that's been sent but hasn't gotten a repeat yet, but is widely considered to be absolutely cutting edge. Megatron, for example, since it's only been climbed by Sean Rabatou, would be considered B3 until it gets repeated, and at that point, stops being considered B3. Everything else just doesn't fit in the scale. It's not exactly surprising it lost its popularity, since really the only people who would even be able to use it are the people at the very cutting edge of the sport. If you were John Gill back in the day, it's not a problem. If you were average Joe, me, or you, well, now we got issues. And now we can finally get to 1991, John Sherman and the creation of the Hueco V-Scale. That's right, fucking 1991. 30 years after the first 7A was recorded in Fontainebleau, John Sherman wrote a Hueco guidebook that his publisher refused to publish unless some sort of difficulty scale was applied. So Sherman, whose nickname was Verm, or Vermin, if you're not into the whole brevity thing, went out with his friends to create a scale. Now at that point, they already had a V-scale. It was just 3 grades, and it was used by Verm's group of friends to give just a tiny bit more nuance to the super friggin' broad John Gill B2 category. What that means is that the benchmark for the original V1 was a climb called Center El Murray, which today is graded V6. The original V2 is a climb called Mushroom Roof, which today is V8, and the benchmark V3 was a climb called Nacho Man, which today is V9. So, you know, easy stuff. So basically, Sherman took that original scale, expanded it, made 510 the new benchmark for V0, came up with most of the grades in his book himself, aka he went around assigning problems he'd sent, a rough difficulty level up to around V5, at which point he handed out questionnaires to his friends, a group of like 12 people, and the only people strong enough to boulder that hard at the time in Hueco, and asked them to reach consensus grades for all the harder stuff. And then voila! The V-scale was born. History. What this means is, well, fucking subjectivity abound, because what V0 is and what any grade is, ultimately, historically, factually, what have you, is just what some dude thought it was that one time when he was asked about it, and really only related to other climbs he was asked about. AKA, hey man, you see that slab over there? If we say that's V0 and then the roof over there is V1, then is that V2? And the other guy's like, sure. That's it. That's what grades are. There's no scientific, mathematical, whatever way of defining what V4 is. All V4 is just slightly harder than V3, but easier than V5. Do you see how batshit insane it is to give them any significant meaning beyond being like a super general guideline? Because that's how I'm going to transition into part 3, the subjectivity of grades. Now, a while ago, a good friend of mine, this dude, Brett Myers, old school developer, is responsible for like, I don't know, a huge chunk of the boulders that have been developed out in the northeast of the US, told me about the first time he went to climb in Hueco with his buddies. This was when the scale had like just started gaining popularity. And it's been a while since I heard this story, and I haven't talked to him in a minute, so I'm very likely butchering the shit out of it. So Brett, if you're watching this, my bad. But the gist is that he was convinced that he and his friends were about to get the ever-loving crap kicked out of them by whatever the true VX was. But what they found was that they actually did surprisingly well. So when they went back and assigned V grades to all the existing problems at their local boulder field, well, they kind of inevitably sandbagged everybody to hell. And see, that's the ultimate problem with grades, because these scales spread organically, meaning whoever brought the V-scale or the font scale to your local spot were either someone who'd gone to Hueco or Font themselves, or were someone who'd gone to a place where those scales existed. Meaning, if you were a local down in Chattanooga, what V7 was supposed to be and what it actually was might have gone through 1, 2, or even more degrees of separation. Essentially, if your local strong person was super good at overhangs, went to Hueco, found overhanging V6 was easy for them, came back and said the local overhung test piece was V6 too, you might find that that same boulder somewhere else could actually be V8. And to the super good techie slab lord, much, much harder, which is why there's such a huge disparity in difficulty from one place to another. Magic wood is notoriously soft, so is albarracine. Why? I don't know. Even more interesting, generally speaking, the type of bouldering that is most popular at your local crag is generally harder than the stuff that's fewer and far between. Fontainebleau is probably the best example of that. We think of Font as the birthplace of bouldering, the place where grades are supposed to make the most sense. But talk to a lot of climbers and you'll find most agree that the slabs in Font are basically impossible, whereas most of the stuff that's overhung is actually kind of soft. But then, if Font is the gold standard of what defines something as hard, how can we so readily call it stiff or soft? We shouldn't, but we do. And that's just the issue with grades. In a vacuum, in essence, a comparison between two boulders, grading one versus another, an arbitrary level of difficulty, makes sense. It's easy, for example, to be like, let's call Midnight Lightning V0, and then let's call Burden of Dreams V1, because V1 is harder than V0. No one on earth will say Midnight Lightning is harder than Burden. But then you expand those scales to hundreds of thousands, if not even millions of boulders worldwide, with millions of different people of different sizes, strengths, opinions, experiences, ego, it all just kind of goes to shit a little bit. The theory is that this is mitigated through consensus, essentially that an amalgam of opinions will eventually allow us to find some sort of truth about what grades best represent a certain climb. The issue is, consensus doesn't take into account a hell of a lot of things. Again, if you grew up climbing in Font, what consensus slab 7A looks like to you is extremely different to what consensus slab V6 looks like to the gym comp kid that's never stepped foot outdoors. And that's how we get to where we are. The inevitable evolution of the scales and their conversions is that even though we use the same names for grading problems, their use under different circumstances now serve very specific and different scenarios. What I mean is the discrepancy between like a moonboard V3 and a mega corporate gym V3 is massive. Same grade, different definition. One is substantially harder than the other. Like, I mean, some moonboard benchmark V3s could easily, and I mean like easily, be graded V7 or even V8 at some of the softer gyms I've seen. And what even happened to gym grades? Well, it's pretty damn simple. Our history lesson has actual outdoor V0 at about the difficulty of the crux of a 5.9, 5.10 route. What that means is, it's a lot harder than most people can even think about climbing on their first day. This wasn't a problem in the 90s when literally no one climbed and even less bouldered because, if you were gonna be a boulderer at that point, odds were you weren't gonna start your climbing journey as a boulderer. You'd be starting it on ropes, and maybe if you were kind of weird, you'd start taking bouldering seriously. Maybe. Like overwhelmingly not though. But now, bouldering is the most popular climbing discipline and how most people are actually introduced to the sport. So gyms needed to do something so their day pass buying customers could, actually do what they pay to do. So they came up with VB and eventually started softening V0 and up to V5 so people could feel some sense of progression. Hilariously enough, probably why so many people actually get stuck at V5 because that's around where outdoor and indoor grades kind of converge again. Usually. Not always. So that's where the meme V2 in my gym comes from. If your gym is sandbagged, or at least close to the original outdoor grades, a V2 there could very well be graded V4 or even V5 in another. And then there's the moonboard or the infamous B-pump in Japan that take pride in how hard they grade stuff and go absolutely fucking batshit crazy doing so. Look, what I'm trying to get at is that what constitutes a consensus grade, V6 or 7A, is not the same in Magic Woods, is not the same in Rocklands, is not the same in your local crag, in your gym, in the gym next to your local gym, on the moon board, the kilter board, the tension board, or fucking anywhere. Which brings me to grades on a personal level. Because you might think you have an idea about how hard VX is supposed to be, but the truth is, that idea changes a lot more than people even realize. The classic is the idea of the morpho climb, short people getting sad that a tall person can reach farther than them, often skipping the crux of a problem entirely. My favorite example when talking about this is the climb Barbed Wire in Lincoln Woods, Rhode Island, USA, for anyone who doesn't know. Barbed wire is notorious for being harder for short people. The mountain project description literally gives a range, saying the climb has been called V7 by people over 6 feet tall and V11 for those under 5'4". But the consensus is V9. So what is it? Is it soft? Is it hard? Who's right about what this thing is supposed to be? The proposed solution, obviously, and the solution that the climbing community has generally accepted as gospel, is that you should be honest with yourself and take whatever grade you genuinely and honestly think the boulder is. So hey, you go to Lincoln Woods on a crisp fall day with your buddies, you're a little taller than most boulderers, you do the climb, you find that it's about as hard as Diesel, another consensus V8 on a different boulder in the same climbing area, and so you loudly proclaim to everyone around you that barbed wire is soft as fuck, and anyone who thinks otherwise sucks at climbing. But the issue, aside from you being kind of a douche, is that even your definition of what V8 is supposed to be, for you personally, is a hell of a lot more fluid than a lot of us climbers even realize. And so the whole a range of opinions eventually reaches a consensus idea, well, that comes with its own new set of problems. Because again, how do you define a grade beyond comparing it to another? You can't. And even if you tried, you still run into problems. I saw a post on Reddit a while ago where some newbie was frustrated that grades weren't somehow linked to like edge size and overhang. What that newbie failed to understand is that, well, jugs are relative. To use gravel, a 10mm edge you gotta hang with one arm is a jug. To the person that's been climbing for a month, even the thought of hanging two-armed on one is so ridiculous it might as well be a freaking Dali surrealist painting. 6'8 plus does not feel the same to Sean Rabitou as it does to me, as it does to you. Even more wild, 6'8 plus to me today does not feel the same as it will tomorrow, as it did yesterday, as it will in 20 years. Because we're humans. We're constantly evolving and growing. We get better at the sport, or life gets in the way and we get worse. We get stronger and weaker. We have high and low gravity days and days where humidity and temperature get in the way of us doing the moves we know we should be strong enough to do. No repeat of a climb is ever going to feel exactly the same, because when you compound those factors, they all add up to wildly different experiences every single time you put your climbing shoes on. I mean, even skin is a huge factor. If you have very little skin, you're gonna be slip and sliding all over the fucking place. So yeah, 5 years ago, I sent my first V7 and it was a goddamn battle. 2 years ago, I went back and I warmed up on it. Still V7? The fuck should I know? I'm a lot heavier at the moment. The same climb might be tougher for me now than it was 2 years ago. And if what I just said about how the definition of V7 is consistently changing from scenario to scenario, how do I even know what V7 is supposed to feel like? What version of V7 am I supposed to adhere to? Do I compare everything to the moon board? Because in that case, that climb might be V5. It was an overhung arête, so do I go the font way and say maybe it was more like a soft-ish V8? Or do I make a comparison to the more vertical face climb nearby that's also graded V7 but in a style I suck at, which makes me feel like this thing's easier and thus more like V6? The issue is, there's no right answer, and no real wrong answer beyond grading something a certain range. I had a friend of mine once jokingly say that he graded his first ascents by giving them the absolute lowest grade he could possibly give them without all of us laughing. He'd send a climb, think, man, that was a hard V5, and then he'd tell us to go check out his latest V3. Which we would do. And we'd struggle on, because he was an asshole. So what then? Are grades just stupid and unimportant? Should they not exist? Was John Sherman right when he said numbers have no soul? I mean, in a way, he kind of was. If I gave someone the chance to climb the best V3 in the world or a chossy, ugly-looking V8, odds are a lot of people would pick the 8. Mostly, I think, because a lot of us want to just get better at climbing. So the 8 represents a higher progression. What we shouldn't forget is that the grade is an arbitrary thing assigned by someone who, odds are, just like you, has no clue what it means at all. Because honestly, despite the number in front of it, the only way to really know how hard a climb is for you is to try and climb it. So really, that's, I guess, what I hope you'll take from this, that any beginners watching will take grades with a grain of salt, that they'll try everything and anything that looks cool, and that the people who climb harder and who have been climbing forever will remember to appreciate the easier stuff when it's actually quality climbing. Because yeah, grade chasing is a thing, it happens, and it's fun. I mean, I can't lie. If there were two climbs that were exactly the same movement, but the holds on one of them was worse, making it a higher grade, odds are I'd probably prefer to try the harder one. I just would. But the important thing is to do so because you're looking to challenge yourself, not because of some arbitrary number in front of it. And also, do not forget that grade scales are arbitrary, that they exist within a range, and that range is actually really fucking big for you and for me and for everybody. So it's perfectly possible for you to flash one V5 but then have to spend multiple sessions on another one. It happens all the time. It's normal. It doesn't reflect on you as a climber, and you shouldn't let it get to you when that happens. Even if you are like, I mean, shit, I know tons of people who are like V12 plus climbers who've gotten stuck on V3 in Font. Fucking keep coming back to Font. But that was absolutely no news at all. Carlo Traversi did the Big Island a couple days ago, so there, that at least satisfies the name of the channel, I guess. Hope you like this little deep dive into grades and climbing bouldering history. Please don't forget to subscribe, comment with your opinions, all that good stuff. If there are other topics you think it'd be fun for me to cover, if you actually enjoyed this, it's the first time I'm making one of these, so let me know what you thought. I'll get on that, but otherwise, go climb some stuff.